Hey, good to see you all. So, everybody got their corn planted? Or is that's not a question you should ask this crowd? Sorry about that. That makes wheat that much more, where I'm going with that, is that makes wheat that much more important this year. And so, how many of y'all were farming in 1996? Got a fair number. And how about 2015? Some of the younger guys will be around. 2015, anybody farming? What did those 2 years have in common in southern Michigan? What one path? Fusarium, mycotoxin, VOM, deoxynivalenol. 96 was, you could see that yield on the yield chart for every state. Ontario, you could see that yield dip. And so, past 20 years, we've made a lot of gains in terms of having control. Right now, we've got Fusarium on the ropes, essentially, and what it takes to keep it there. Fungicides applied at the right time. Persaro, Caramba, Moravis Ace is coming down the line. Genetics, variety resistance. This is the most important thing I'll say in the next 20 minutes. Variety resistance is the most effective control for Fusarium, FHB, scab. Variety resistance is the most important component. A moderately resistant variety, unsprayed with a fungicide, has better control than spraying a susceptible variety with a fungicide. Just genetics is better than the chemistry. The absolute best control for scab is the combination of both. Moderately resistant varieties sprayed with a fungicide. So how do we know, what does that even mean, Dr. Olson? What does that even mean, moderate resistance? What is that? We test these varieties we're essentially simulating 1996 out here every single year in this acre behind us. We have over 400 unique genotypes of wheat replicated 3-4 times, and we've got every night between 10 a.m. and 2 a.m. we are bombarding these plants with about 2.5 billion spores, right? We are infecting these to the highest level. We'll see 35 ppm down in the most susceptible varieties. So we're creating worst case scenario. Yes, sir? They travel pretty far, so actually they catch wind, and so and these rye borders actually function as like an evaporative cooling system. When they get wet, and we actually have spores in those borders too. So when the wind blows, it's very localized. Yeah, I know. I hear you. I hear you. You need a moderately resistant variety for that. So we have that data available to y'all every single year. So we look at a couple different things. When we're looking at visual traits, so we look at the wheat spike itself. How far does that pathogen travel? So it gets in there and infects through the flower, right, into that spikelet. And whether or not that pathogen moves up and down in that spikelet is a measure of resistance. So if 100% of that spike is infected, if it's necrotic, if it's killed that whole spike and infected all that grain, that is very susceptible. That's 100% severity. If you see just one spikelet, it's infected. That spore got in there, but it didn't go anywhere. That's resistance. That's type 2 resistance. That's severity. That's about 10% severity if you have just one spikelet infected. So that's one measure. Another measure is if you're looking at a field and you look at let's say a 9 square foot, a 3x3 area, and you count the number, find a random area in your field, you count the number of spikes that are infected, that's incidence. That's a percentage, the percent of total number of spikes that are infected. So when we evaluate these rows, we're looking at, in total, how many of those spikes are infected. Now when we have really good disease pressure, we'll see 70 to 90, we saw 100% infection last year in the most susceptible varieties, but there are some that have a lower level of infection. When you combine those two, the visual, the severity, and the incidence together, you get an FHB index. In this case, lower is better, right? You don't want to have a high value for that. So you can multiply those two together, divide by 100, and you get a pretty good index. Your moderately resistant varieties are going to have an FHB index anywhere from 1, of course you always see infection, 1 to maybe 30. If you see 50 or above, that's a risk, right? That's a risk, just based on those visual traits. The most important trait that we have in our program and to y'all at the elevator is DON, the mycotoxin. So we have that evaluated. We can push these up to 35 parts per million in some of the most susceptible varieties. Those varieties with moderate resistance will have 3 to 4, maybe 5, under nuclear conditions. Worst case scenario, variety resistance can get you almost to economic levels, right, where there's zero dockage in the most resistant materials. You couple that, you've taken a moderately resistant variety that's at 3 ppm down, spray that with a fungicide at the right time, you're safe. You cut that down in half. You're at 1.5, 1 to 1.5. You can sell that grain without dockage. And the millers in this state and the millers in our region, most of our wheat that we produce in this state is actually milled and turned into flour locally. They can shave that bran layer off and cut another ppm off, and now you can actually sell that flour internationally, right? You can use those in food products. So that combination, the most important combination, the best risk mitigation for scab is that variety resistance and that fungicide applied at the right time. I've been thrilled to see the number of spray tracks out there at flowering right now. Not all varieties flower at the same time too. Now we see, I've been taking, it was 5 days in the state variety trial, taking notes at Mason, and some of them aren't even done yet, right? So you have extremely early varieties, and then you can have varieties that flower 5 to 6 days later. So you have this huge window for management. And when you select a variety on both ends, you're spreading your risk, because you can have weather events that could prevent you from spraying. If you have a moderately resistant variety, you're a little better off, but you could have weather events that prevent you from spraying the early material, but you have time. If you split your acres with 2 different varieties, your second variety that potentially flowers later is at less risk, right? You can apply your management at the right time. So having that moderately resistant variety, applying the fungicide at the right time, and splitting the maturities and therefore spreading your risk, you can help mitigate the overall risk for scab. So that interaction, I keep saying this over and over, that interaction between the moderate resistance and the fungicide application is the best policy for mitigating scab. I want to cover a couple myth busters here, and in that you're not taking a yield penalty when you select a moderately resistant variety. They are not mutually exclusive. Some of the highest yielding lines that are available to Michigan growers are scab resistant. They're out there. And so the data that we collect, we're going to be out here and for probably 3 days straight, we're going to do nothing but rate this material. So we put all that together in the state variety trial report, so it's there. You got a couple. In the first, it was table 3 this year, and so I think the most important column. Okay, you got overall yield, but you got to look at that scab resistance too. The one column, moderately resistant versus very susceptible, right? So those are major decisions. So you guys are going to be making these decisions probably within the next 8 weeks. You're going to be making variety planting decisions and buying seed that's going to affect your profitability in 2020. So that data is out there. It's available now. So I really encourage you to seek that out. And if you're salesman, if you're seed dealer, your elevator, if they don't have the variety you want, make them get it. Get that variety, right? So they're out there. And so you guys have a handout today too that has a single page that has both red and white. So that's my first Mythbusters. There are high yielding, moderately resistant varieties. The second one is it's not restricted to market class. There are scab resistant soft white wheat. Is any white wheat growers here? Well, red wheat guys. Okay, they're out there. The one that's in the marketplace right now, it's kind of on the cusp of moderately susceptible to moderately resistant, but it's the best one out there that has that combination of resistance. 9242W from Dynagro. And they sell out of it, I think, every year. We have something better coming down the line from our breeding program. Right now it's just got a name, Michigan 14W190, and it's got the FHB1 gene. It's got a really strong resistance to it, coming from that gene and other sources. But it's also very high yielding. So we now have that combination of high yield and scab resistance. The scab resistance in W190 is better than any red wheat that's out there. So it shows that the scab resistance is not exclusive to market class. It's not dependent on grain color. So you can't have it all, folks. You can have scab resistance and high yield potential in your varieties. Any questions from you all? I kind of into a monologue here, but I'd like to hear any questions you all might have. Yes, sir.
How
So you have about a 4-day window. You still have efficacy up to 4 days, and I have to credit that to Marty Chilvers and his group, who have done those timing studies. You do have a bit of a window. Now, some of the claims for Moravis Ace that you can apply before flowering, they're not entirely true, but you have that. You have about a 3 to 4 day window, up to a 4-day window. You can go up to 6 days, but the efficacy drops off after day 4. You still have time. You have it depends on how much tile you have. I guess is essentially, that's where genetics comes into play. That's where that comes into play.
Ellen has got a product that they claim that has about a 10 to 14 day window. And obviously there's an optimum.
Yes.
But residuals, I see chemical companies work on residuals. Talk about that.
I hesitate to. The ones that I'm most familiar. I know Fusarium, Caramba, and Moravis Ace are the chemistries that have been vetted by my colleagues in the U.S. through the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative as instrumental to allowing us to do this type of research. You do with the standard chemistries, Fusarium and Caramba. You do have potentially up to a 4-day window. Now Moravis Ace does. It's marketed to have a longer residual, and that may be the chemistry that we're thinking about here. And
research on that to open that window up.
Right.
My question is, yeah, you're paying more, but what you getting? I mean, is it just snake oil, or what is it?
There is potentially there is benefit to having a 14-day window. It would not be necessary. So that pathogen infects within that precise window from flowering to 5 to 6 days after flowering is when that's the opportunity. So once, and it relates to it affects to the flower, right? Those of you who worked with sclerotinia in dry beans and soybeans, it's the same kind of phenomenon where that pathogen gets in the flower, through the flower, and once grain fill is initiated, plant changes, it's not going to be infected. So 10 days after flowering, that plant is already filling grain, right? You see that berry starting to fill up. It's not going to be, there won't be new infections at that time period. So it may not be necessary at that long of an interval there.
Well, this year's a prime example because there's low spots, non-tiles.
That's right.
That's got suppression on growth, and so even though it's planted at the same time, same
variation in within the same field. I see it. We see it in our nurseries too. That's a major challenge. So trying to find that sweet spot is important. Of course, you have to balance the weather forecast, right? But it is important to find kind of that middle ground, and that is a risk. If you apply a fungicide, if you have potentially uneven maturities even within a field, right, caused by water damage, those spots in the fields that haven't even headed yet or have just come out of the boot after you've sprayed are not protected, and so you can't have this mixed bag of protected areas and unprotected areas, and I think that just adds credence to selecting a resistant variety, so you do have a safety net there. In those cases, when management fails, it doesn't fail altogether, but where you have gaps in management, the variety resistance can fill that gap.
Are you seeing any in that window with generation chemistry being effective? Granted, you got a bell curve, but the window is what
I know, I'm trying not to affect anybody's bottom line with my answer, but I want to say no. I don't think there isn't the data, the 1-year data that we have on some of these new products that my colleagues have produced does not support that extended window, and the claims that you can apply earlier. Some of the claims are that you can apply earlier, right at heading, and then that residual will last all the way through flowering. And so far the data don't necessarily support it with that 1 year of data. And I'm going to keep my response guarded to allow for that potential for multi-year trials to find further support for that potentially.
We need to go a little sooner.
I'll let the plant pathologist work on that. I'll try to stay in my lane here, working on genetics. So now that combination of moderate resistance and fungicides, they work together well because they cover those couple different mechanisms of resistance. I'm talking about type 1 resistance, the incidence. That's where that pathogen found a way in, right? If you have 100 heads, 50 of them got infected, 50 of them found a way in, but 50 of them were protected. That fungicide limits that initial infection. It prevents the movement of that pathogen spore into the plant, right? So it's covering the surface, it's protecting against that high level of incidence, it's protecting against the initial infection. Some always get through. Even in fungicide trials, if you look at some of the photos, I follow folks on Twitter from Missouri and Illinois, and their fungicide trials yes, they're a lower incidence, but they still get through. So once that pathogen gets into that spike, that's where genetics takes over. In a susceptible variety, if it gets in there, it's still going to wipe out the entire spike potentially. If you have a resistant variety that has strong type 2 resistance, it'll limit it. It will wall that pathogen off into one spike. So even though it got in there, it's not going very far. So it's that combination of the fungicide preventing entry of the pathogen and then the genetic resistance walling off the pathogen once it's there. It never gets in the front door. Keeps it, and then if it doesn't get past the foyer, I guess you could say, if it does get in there with genetic resistance. It's a good way to think about it. Yes, sir.
You've been too bad to get in there and it's flowering now. Do you give up?
No.
Better late than never?
Better late than never in this case. Yeah. Even with
How long is that window?
yeah, it is a problem. I would the economics will dictate that, right? In the end, if you know what variety you have and you know what to expect, if it's a susceptible or even a moderately susceptible, it would be worth it. Investing in that spray. That's where there's a tipping point. But I would strongly suggest spraying if you've got 4 or 5 days. If we do get some good drying weather, if we have days like today, good sunshine, good wind, good drying weather, and not too much rain in the near future, I think it would be worth doing. You do have up to 4 days, 4 to 5 days. We are past that now, so okay, I would give it another 2 days. 6 days is where after 6 days it drops off pretty significantly, but there still is some effect up to 6 days. No, I don't think that's a good question for Dr. Chilvers. He's done the work right here on this farm, so that really shows 4 days is you still have that 4-day window, and then it's up to 6 days where it can drop off a little bit. But check which variety you have, so you can estimate that risk based on the variety that's out there.
I was told that moderate, after the 4-day window, you lose 70% effectivity. Is that reasonable?
It's pretty high. It does drop off after 4 days. Yeah. I don't know if it's 70%. I'd have to check on the data on that, but yeah, there is a drop off, and that just goes back to having that genetic resistance there too, where it's a safety net. Because we know that management can be tricky. It's not always a sure deal that you're going to be able to get out there. But genetics that comes in the bag. That goes in the planter, right? That's with you full season. Genetic resistance is full season. It's in the bag. So versus that fungicide timing, you're depending on the weather for that to get that just right. So genetic resistance can be pretty important. Yeah, and so I really hope you're able to, to get out there today, or there are always it's going to happen, and that I can't stress enough the value of resistance and it's out there. So take a look at your handout today and seek some of the other resources. We have the variety trials posted, table number 3 if you're looking at the 2018 trial report. So sounds a little absurd, but I'm thrilled when we have really good disease pressure in our nursery. I like to see good disease because that really separates things out. We had the best data that we've ever had last year. So I hope we have a repeat this year.
That was all artificially induced last year.
Artificially induced? No, it was there were pockets. We had some at Mason. There were a few pockets up in the Tuscola County, Richville area there, where I spend more time. Mason, we got it at Mason, the Mason farm, just 7 miles south of here. Overall, it was too hot and dry last year, and so you don't know what each year is going to bring, and that's the challenge with this pathogen, is that you can never really predict what the next year is going to be. There's a lot of variation, and so it is a risk when planting a susceptible variety. At least when you plant a moderately resistant variety, you know that you have part of that risk covered. And that's the value of having these screening nurseries. Even though there isn't scab out there in the variety trials or in a lot of growers' fields, you're not able to get this data other places every year. But folks like Amanda and Tommy have done a great job in this nursery, and Sam getting the misting. Tommy's a grad student in my group. He's helped with all this. So these guys do a great job in making sure we have heavy disease pressure out here every year, and we'll be out here. And unfortunately, we flowered so late this year. We are in cool season grass paradise right now with these low temperatures and cool nights. And what that should do is translate into grain fill for you guys too. Very good grain fill period. And what I think that we may miss out on in terms of having variability in the fields, late planting, I think that the weather, if this weather pattern holds, we can make that up with an extended grain fill period. So as long as we get a good 4 or 5 weeks of grain fill, we can make that up. That's one of the strengths of Michigan wheat production, is that we're able to fill a little bit longer. And that's why places like UK and Germany can get 200 bushel per acre yield. It's because they have 2 months of grain fill, right? And so I'm thinking that this weather is really gonna help pick things up a little bit later in the season, pulling a big win for us in the fourth quarter here. So, any other questions or comments from you all?
How far behind are we this year for normal?
12 days, and flowering is 12 days behind in this part of the state. I think if you go a little further north, it might be 2 weeks. Yeah, you might see 2 weeks there, depending on the variety. Some of the later maturity varieties are really slow, but there are varieties that are right out of the gate, that are unaffected really by the photo period will dictate everything. Once you get past 16-hour days, it pushes wheat to flower, so eventually it'll get shoved into flowering. But some of these 80-degree temperature spikes will really push the early maturity varieties. And there are a lot of differences out there in variety maturities. Some of the folks that have been growing, I could name off some of the distribution here. Some of your MCIA's flipper that's out there, that's extremely early. And you have something like a DF line. DF 112 is kind of that early to mid maturity, and folks growing Syngenta like a Cy 100 is kind of on the later end. And the white wheat folks growing Jupiter know that's kind of late. So that really is kind of the spectrum that we see on varieties that are out there. And again, that can influence management, right? If you have 2 different varieties out there, and one's flowered now, and one's flowering 3-4 days later, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket in that case. Yes, you might have to get the sprayer out twice. That's the other end of it. If conditions are ideal, you might have to put stuff down and then pick it back up again, right? We want to just run continuously, I know. But it's worth splitting maturities like that. Absolutely. So I hope you all are able to stick around for the afternoon as well. We have at the Mason farm, we have 20 more acres of wheat down there, and we've got some spring wheat trials that you can check out where we've sourced some soft white spring wheats from the Pacific North, Idaho and Washington, and we're actually applying some different management practices to spring wheat. So in the event that you do have fields that have to be torn up, maybe some of you are hanging on to wheat that you wanted to be corn at this time of year. I'm sure that's happened in some cases. But if you're contracted and you need to have wheat in the ground, we are looking for ways to make spring wheat work here and Michigan. So we're looking at some different starter, different nitrogen, different fungicide regimens on spring wheat to try and find an optimum yield as a backup. We also have new lines coming from the breeding program. You know, we're working on pushing yield potential, and we have some very good scab resistance and some very good looking lines down there. And we also have the state variety trials down there too. So if you want to take a look and actually get to see those varieties, if you have 1 or 2 varieties at home, maybe 3, you know, you can shop around a little bit, see what's out there in terms of the maturity and different plant architectures. And that's why I like working on wheat. Every wheat variety is very unique relative to the others. So if you want to check, if you've got a couple hours this afternoon, come on down and check it out.